a task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. Report. Content warning. Report contains discussions of racial discrimination, sexual assault, torture, lynching, and other forms of extreme violence. The report contains unedited historical quotations and photographs of white supremacist hatred, torture, lynching, autopsy, and other forms of graphic violence.
Infrastructure and public services. Nationally and within California, African Americans have suffered disproportionate harms, both environmental and otherwise, as a result of governmental investment and neglect relating to infrastructure and public services. Neglected water systems. Communities across the U.S. face these infrastructure disparities daily. The crisis of water quality and lead poisoning in Flint, Michigan, is an example of governmental neglect that led to the poisoning of a black community. 37. And Michigan, in Genesee County, which is now a majority black city, was originally populated largely by white workers for the General Motors GM Corporation, which recruited workers in the 1920s and 30s through built itself and then sold subject to restrictive covenants preventing sale to non-white persons. 38. Private discrimination was cemented and continued through federal redlining in the 1940s, as GM also discriminated in the jobs it offered to the few black residents of Flint, who generally worked as janitorial staff. 139. However, starting in the 1960s, as a larger black population arrived, pockets of Flint experienced white flight, which accelerated dramatically across Flint through the 1970s as the automotive industry suffered. 140. 2014, the entire city of Flint decided to switch its drinking water source from Detroit's system to the Flint River to save money. 141 residents thereafter complained for months that their water both smelled and appeared worse, but city and state officials continued to maintain the water was safe for human consumption, even as they explicitly chose not to test the water's safety. 142 after. Chapter 7. Racism in Environment and Infrastructure. Leaked internal memo from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency reported high levels of lead due to the corrosivity of the Flint River water. State officials continued to falsely maintain the levels were safe and called the federal report an outlier. Residents of Los Angeles were already almost twice as likely to die during a heat wave as other residents because of the heat islands, attributable to a history of redlining and segregation. 43. By the time Flint switched back to Detroit's water system, children were exposed to massive amounts of lead with potentially irreversible health consequences for both young children and those exposed in utero through their mothers. 44. Those consequences include learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and behavioral problems. 145. Again, because Flint had become a majority black city at the time of the crisis, these impacts were experienced by black Michiganders far more so than other groups. Even in 2017, after years of attention and remediation, water still had higher rates of lead than 98% of the rest of the state. 146. Showed that the amount of children in Flint with lead pollution in their blood almost doubled as a result of the crisis, while both state officials and Michigan Governor Rick Snyder continued to downplay the issue. 47. The Michigan State Attorney General has attributed responsibility for the crisis to all levels of state and local government, filing charges against various state and local officials including former Governor Snyder. 148. The charges range from perjury, related to actions designed to cover up malfeasance, to manslaughter. 49. Sewage systems. Historically, African Americans were subjected to environmental and health consequences as a result of failure to equitably construct sewer and other waste management systems. U.S. cities relied on private waterworks. 150. By the mid-19th century, cities across America began substantial investment in constructing modern, sanitary sewer and garbage removal systems. 51. Black neighborhoods were not provided with such systems as early, or at all, as compared to white neighborhoods. 52. In fact, the impetus for provision of such services to black neighborhoods was sometimes to prevent diseases that resulted from the lack of such services from crossing from black neighborhoods into white ones. 53. Illness and death resulting from poor sewage disposal dramatically diverged for black and white Americans as the latter gained access to effective sewage systems while the former did not. 54. For example, early 20th century New York, black residents were forced to live in lowland areas near drainage pools for sewage while white residents lived on higher ground with better drainage. 155 As a result, black people died from malaria at much higher rates than white people and experienced higher rates of diseases like dysentery and typhoid. 56 Similar patterns existed across the South as well. 57 Nation. As residential segregation increased throughout the 20th century, black neighborhoods actually lost access to water and sewer municipal services, since it enabled municipalities to more easily prioritize white over black neighborhoods for better services. 58 These disparities continue today. As recently as 2019, New York City acknowledged its responsibility for a massive leak caused by a collapsed pipe in a largely black neighborhood of Queens, which flooded 127 homes with raw sewage. 159 Many of these houses were destroyed or severely damaged, losses that were not covered by basic homeowners or rental insurance. 160 Burdens. African Americans nationally are subject to disproportionately higher costs and disproportionately poorer service with respect to the electrical grid. Households in America spend more on residential energy bills than white households, even when controlling for income, household size, and other possibly relevant factors. 161 Across the country, African Americans shoulder energy burdens that are disproportionately larger than any other racial group, meaning they spend a larger portion of their income on energy. 162 This is true in major California cities as well, such as Los Angeles and San Francisco. 163 These disproportionate costs are partially attributable to African Americans living in older, energy-inefficient homes as a result of the legacy of redlining and other discriminatory housing policies. 164 Low-income African Americans are also twice as likely to have their utility service shut off as similarly low-income white Americans. 165 Which advocates have argued are the result of inflexible shut-off regulations and disproportionate energy burdens. 66 18th century, as cities built sewer and garbage systems, they ignored or built them slower for black neighborhoods. 20th century, black neighborhoods lost access to water and sewage services as cities prioritized white neighborhoods. 157 Chapter 7 Racism in Environment and Infrastructure. Because of lower rates of home ownership in the black community, African Americans also often cannot take advantage of programs aimed at lessening energy burdens that require home ownership to utilize. Home solar panels. 167 Or installation of free charging stations for electric vehicles. 168 As discussed in more detail above, African Americans also suffer disproportionate burdens related to the production of energy, as power plants, including those fired by coal, continue to be disproportionately located in their neighborhoods. Particulate matter emissions that cause damage to the heart, lungs, and brain. 69 Racist transportation systems. State and local governments have consistently failed to offer equitable transit options for black communities throughout American history. The earliest form of transportation discrimination was the trafficking of black Africans in slave ships, discussed more fully in Chapter 2 Enslavement. Federal government allowed and regulated this form of human trafficking until 1808, when the importation of enslaved people was outlawed. 70 By the late 1700s, the Underground Railroad, an organized effort of safe houses and activists, helped transport enslaved people to freedom. 71 Between 1810 and 1850, the Underground Railroad freed an estimated 100,000 enslaved persons. 72 Same time, both the South and the North segregated travelers by race. Frederick Douglass was often dragged out of his seat, beaten, and severely bruised by conductors and brakemen when he refused to ride in the Jim Crow car as he rode trains in New England. 73 The federal government supported these segregation efforts, even as some states attempted to desegregate. For example, in 1877, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down a Louisiana civil rights law requiring the desegregation of transport as unconstitutional. 74 Dekier, a black woman, bought a first-class ticket on a steamboat, but was sent to the second-class cabin because first class was for whites only. 175 The court overturned a decision from the Louisiana Supreme Court to award legal damages to Dekier based on a state law requiring desegregated transport, holding that Louisiana had no authority to regulate such transport. 76 In 1896, in contrast, the United States Supreme Court explicitly permitted segregation in public transit when it upheld Louisiana's law requiring transportation segregation. 77 This history of government segregation set the stage for unequal transportation for African Americans that continues to the present. Of the century, subsidized by government funds, private companies constructed mass transit systems in America's cities. 78 Until around the 1950s, nearly all transit was built and operated by private companies. 79 Many transit companies struggled to remain profitable in the 1920s, especially after the Depression. 180 The widespread adoption of the automobile combined with white Americans' move to the suburbs, as described in Chapter 5, Housing Segregation, resulted in the company's financial failure. 81 Public transit systems cut back services as masses of white riders left the system and never expanded to the suburbs. 182 As government and private actors erected barriers to prevent African Americans from moving to the suburbs, poorer black workers without cars were left with few public transportation options. 83 When manufacturing and industrial jobs moved from urban centers to suburban or rural areas, urban black workers were often unable to follow due to lack of transportation options. 184. 68. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. described how city planning decisions result in transportation systems that failed black communities, urban transit systems in most American cities. Become a genuine civil rights issue, and a valid one, because the layout of rapid transit systems determines the accessibility of jobs to the black community. Transportation systems in American cities could be laid out so as to provide an opportunity for poor people to get meaningful employment, then they could begin to move into the mainstream of American life. 85. Government has been aware of this failure to support transportation for the black urban workforce, but has not provided a remedy. 68. The report of the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, also known as the Kerner Commission Report, studied the causes and effects of riots in U.S. cities. 186 In order to enhance employment opportunities for Central City residents, the report recommended the creation of improved transportation links between black urban neighborhoods and new job locations in the suburbs. 187. 60s and 70s, the federal government began providing funding for public transit, and many municipalities took control of transit operations. 88 However, scholars argue that these revitalized agencies built a segregated system. 189 The municipal transit agencies that were created throughout the 70s and into the 80s were designed to be responsive to the demands of the local communities, demands which had often grown resegregationist as a backlash to the civil rights movement. 190 This created transit systems that were 158. 7. In environment and infrastructure. By design, municipal agencies did not cater to urban riders who relied exclusively on public transit, instead channeling greater resources to entice mostly white suburban commuters who could also choose to drive. 191 This translated to less comfortable seats, unshaded waiting areas, and bumpier, more unpleasant rides for black users of public transit. 192. This system continues to operate today. African Americans still rely on public transit to get to work at much higher rates than white workers. Workers commute by public transit at nearly 4 times the rate of white workers. 193 Moreover, black workers on average experience higher commute times than white workers, both nationally and in California. 194 Finally, since most fares are usually flat, low-income people pay a higher share of their monthly salary on transit, which is more likely to impact African Americans and other people of color. 95 Due to these government actions, workers relying on public transit, who are more often black than white, often pay comparatively more money and commute for a longer amount of time if they are able to use transit to get to jobs at all. 96. To discrimination in the public transit system. As discussed in Chapter 5, our country's highway system destroyed black neighborhoods and intensified residential segregation by separating black neighborhoods from white neighborhoods. In telecom, Americans also face disproportionate burdens with respect to the national telecommunications network. 1960 through 2010, African Americans have had significantly lower rates of telephone access than white Americans, though this gap has reduced over as telephone use became more ubiquitous. 97 More recently, fewer African Americans have access to broadband internet access than white Americans. A 2021 study in Indiana revealed that 56.2% of Black residents lacked reliable access to internet service and/or a computer, compared to 34.8% of white residents. 198. This lack of telecommunications impacts economic and educational opportunities. Black teens are almost twice as likely to report that they cannot complete all their homework due to lack of access to a computer or reliable internet access. 199. In addition to difficulty accessing the internet, African Americans are disadvantaged by racist structures within it. Dr. Wade Milner testified before the California Task Force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans that search algorithms, machine learning, automated resource allocation systems. Credit reporting agencies are all built by software engineers that are overwhelmingly white. As a result, the implicit biases of these human software engineers have been built into seemingly neutral algorithms and artificial intelligence, with discriminatory effects. 201. For example, in 2016, when Amazon Prime same-day delivery services were introduced in Atlanta, Georgia, virtually 100% of white residents were given access to the service, but less than half of Black residents did. Two similar patterns existed for Black residents of Boston and Chicago. 203. California authorized segregated public transportation at least until 1864. 204. The governments of California and its municipalities have chosen infrastructure projects that have harmed Black communities. California and federal law require state and municipal agencies to consider racially disparate impacts of infrastructure projects today. Historical damage caused by highways in particular has contributed to higher exposure to air pollution among communities of color, as discussed above. The federal government, California's government, historically neglected water infrastructure as it applied to Black Californians. One example is California's treatment of Black families fleeing the Dust Bowl. These left the prairie states and came to farmland across California starting in the 1930s, experiencing widespread infrastructure discrimination from state and local governments. 5. For example, Black Californians in the San Joaquin Valley were excluded from most urban areas with access to clean water as a result of explicit redlining policies, racially restrictive housing covenants, and even racially motivated violence. 6. In Tulare County, the largely Black community of Teviston had no access to sewer and water infrastructure, while the adjacent community of Pixley did. 207. Again, this discrimination continued until recently. The town of Lanier, also formed by Black families fleeing the Dust Bowl, had no running water at all until the 1970s, and was subjected to dangerous levels of arsenic in the water even after wells and pipes were drilled. 108. The town's residents did not get access to clean drinking until 2019. 209. Government entities were explicit in weaponizing infrastructure against Black Californians. In the 1950s, a developer in Milpitas, a town north of San Jose, sought to build a large housing development open to both white and Black homebuyers. 10. He managed to overcome several zoning-related obstacles only to discover that the Milpitas City Council had increased the sewer connection fee more than tenfold explicitly to thwart the development. 211. Black neighborhoods in California still suffer extremely high rates of water pollution in the water provided through government infrastructure. 2019, the New York Times reported that as many as 1,000 community water systems in California may be at high risk of failing to deliver potable water, with a disproportionate number of these systems located in low-income areas. Tend to be disproportionately Black. 212. California's Environmental Protection Agency has also acknowledged that contamination of water sources disproportionately impacts communities of color. 213. LA report in 2021 identified 29 failing water systems in Los Angeles County, and these systems largely service communities of color. 14. For example, in 2019, authorities dissolved the Sativa Los Angeles County Water District for servicing brown water for decades to its customers in Willowbrook and the historically Black neighborhood of Compton. 15. In Oakland, the majority Black McClemens High School has had a history of serious water contamination issues in recent years, from lead pollution to dangerously high levels of chemical solvent groundwater pollution that led to the school's temporary closure in 2020. 216. Transportation discrimination impacts Black Californians as well. 65. The California governor created the McCone Commission to examine causes of civil unrest in Los Angeles in 1965, identifying inadequate and costly transportation as contributing to high rates of unemployment among the black urban population. California has not designed its transportation system to address this need, often favoring rail options catering to suburbs rather than bus lines used by urban areas with greater black populations. 117. These choices have led to several high-profile lawsuits, including in Los Angeles and San Francisco in the 117. These choices have led to several high-profile lawsuits, including in Los Angeles and San Francisco in the 1990s and 2000s. 218. Design of public transit by major municipalities in the state often catered to the largely white suburban residents because they were seen as needing better options in order to choose public transit. Example, Oakland's San Antonio neighborhood, the most racially diverse in the city and one of the densest parts of the Bay Area, sees the Bay Area Rapid Transit BART train travel for nearly 3 miles without stopping. 119. By contrast, in suburban Walnut Creek and Pleasant Hill, which are less than half as dense, BART stations are only 1 3/4 miles apart. 220. In the late 1960s, BART was literally designed to hurry white suburban commuters past black city neighborhoods and residents. 221. This purposeful decision by the government left black residents without the same transit options to reach jobs and limited economic mobility and opportunity. 22. A $484 million elevated people mover, which connects BART to the airport, lost federal funding because it was found to have a discriminatory impact. Its construction led to the elimination of a bus route in the minority neighborhoods it bypasses. 123. But, though the project lost federal funding, it still went ahead, and the Oakland neighborhood still lost its bus line. 24. Although the disparities between black and white residents in terms of raw internet access in California is much smaller than nationally, 225. Research has shown that black neighborhoods in both Los Angeles and had the least investment in broadband internet in those cities. 226. Conclusion. Various forms of environment and infrastructure-related discrimination suffered by African Americans in this country are rooted in the badges and incidents of slavery that have never been eliminated in this country. Enslaved persons were released from bondage and forced into unhealthy, dangerous, and overcrowded housing, located in the most toxic areas in our cities, which also lacked proper water and sewage services. Residential segregation and government regarding modern infrastructure development reinforced these patterns throughout the 20th century. Americans have been denied equal access to telecommunication services, and are increasingly subjected to algorithms and other forms of computerized decision-making with racist underpinnings and outcomes. These racist systems have harmed and will continue to harm African Americans.